Love in the Shadows, a Toxic Tale. Chapter 1. The Meet Cute. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, blending with the comforting hum of quiet conversations and the soft clink of mugs in the cozy local coffee shop. The light outside filtered through the window, casting a golden glow over Sarah's figure as she sat at her usual corner table. Her eyes, a soft hazel, focused intently on a stack of colorful drawings sprawled before her. These were the latest creations of her kindergarten class, a series of whimsical depictions of animals, houses, and stick figures that she was carefully grading. Her gentle smile, a reflection of the pride she felt in her students' efforts, tugged at her lips as she admired their creativity. With each sketch, her heart swelled with a love for teaching that radiated through her every movement. As she picked up one particularly charming drawing of a dog with 3 legs, she chuckled softly to herself. There was an innocence in the strokes of the crayon, and the sight of it filled her with warmth. Unbeknownst to her, across the room, Jake had just walked in. Dressed in a tailored suit, his polished shoes clicked sharply against the floor as he entered the cafe. He was a businessman through and through, with a sharp gaze and an air of confidence that effortlessly commanded attention. But as his eyes scanned the room for a place to sit, they fell on Sarah. The sight of her, her warm expression as she laughed lightly at the drawing in front of her, caught him off guard. There was something undeniably magnetic about her presence. Her kindness seemed to shine through even in such a quiet moment, and he found himself inexplicably drawn to her. He hesitated for only a moment, then, with a confidence that came naturally to him, walked over to her table. The soft clicking of his shoes on the wooden floor broke the bubble of Sarah's quiet world. She looked up, startled at first, but then immediately disarmed by his smile. "Excuse me," Jake began, his voice warm but steady. "I couldn't help but notice how much joy you seem to find in whatever you're doing. It's contagious. Mind if I join you?" Sarah blinked for a moment, caught off guard by the boldness of his approach, but then, intrigued, she smiled. There was something genuine about him, and she appreciated his appreciation for her work. "Of course," she said, her voice soft and inviting as she gestured to the empty chair across from her. "I'd be happy for the company." Jake took a seat, the conversation starting almost immediately. It was effortless, like they had known each other for years. As he asked about her drawings, Sarah's face lit up with passion. She spoke about her students, how they each brought something unique to the table, how their unfiltered creativity constantly amazed her. The more she talked, the more Jake realized just how special she was. There was a purity to her enthusiasm that was intoxicating. In turn, Sarah found herself captivated by Jake's genuine interest in her life. He listened to her with rapt attention, his focus unbroken, and she couldn't help but feel a connection growing between them. As they exchanged stories, their chemistry became undeniable. Sarah laughed at his jokes, her eyes sparkling, and Jake smiled, unable to hide the admiration he felt for her warmth and wit. By the time their conversation wound down, both felt as though the world outside had faded away. The clamor of the cafe seemed distant, as if only they existed in this small moment of time. When it was time to leave, there was a palpable sense of regret. Neither of them wanted to say goodbye. "Maybe we could meet again sometime?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with hope. Sarah's smile deepened and she reached for her phone. "I'd like that," she said, handing him her number. They exchanged a few more pleasantries before parting ways, but as Sarah watched Jake walk out of the coffee shop, a flutter of excitement filled her chest. It was the beginning of something new, something unexpected and full of promise. Chapter 2. The Whirlwind Romance. In the early days of their relationship, Jake swept Sarah off her feet like a whirlwind. His grand gestures and constant attention left her feeling cherished and special in ways she had never experienced before. He sent her flowers at work, lavish bouquets of roses and lilies that brightened her desk and made her smile every time she walked into the office. He planned extravagant dates, from intimate rooftop dinners with twinkling lights to spontaneous weekend getaways to charming bed and breakfasts in the countryside. He showered her with sweet, thoughtful text messages throughout the day, each one making her heart flutter as she read his words, imagining his voice in her head. Sarah couldn't believe how lucky she was to be with someone who seemed so perfect, his every move so carefully calculated to win her affection. She often caught herself daydreaming, imagining their future together. When he smiled at her across the table or whispered sweet nothings into her ear, she felt like she was living in a fairy tale. His compliments were constant, his attention unwavering. Every moment they shared seemed like the start of something extraordinary, a love story that would unfold with no end in sight. But as the weeks passed, cracks began to appear in Jake's seemingly perfect facade. At first they were small, barely noticeable, just little comments that Sarah brushed off as unimportant. It started when they were out shopping, and Jake glanced at the dress she was holding up. "You'd look so much better in something more elegant," he remarked casually, almost too casually, as if it was just an innocent suggestion. Sarah, always the easygoing type, simply smiled and nodded, thinking he was only trying to help her improve her style. "Maybe you're right," she said, not wanting to make a big deal out of it. But the comments didn't stop there. Over time, they became more frequent, more pointed. "That dress is a little too casual, don't you think?" Jake would say, his tone light, but with an undercurrent of criticism that made Sarah's stomach twist. She began second-guessing her wardrobe choices, wondering if perhaps he was right. Maybe she wasn't dressing the way someone like him would expect. After all, he was always impeccably put together, and maybe she needed to match that. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Then came the jealousy. It started subtly at first, with Jake expressing his discomfort when Sarah mentioned a male coworker. "He seems too friendly with you," Jake would say, his voice tight with an emotion Sarah couldn't quite place. She laughed it off, thinking it was just a harmless reaction. After all, they were just coworkers, right? But as time went on, his comments became more pointed, more insistent. "I just don't trust them," he'd mutter when she mentioned spending time with any of her male colleagues. "You should limit your interactions with them. It's not like you need to hang out with them all the time." Sarah tried to reassure him, telling him that her friendships were innocent, that there was nothing to worry about, but Jake's possessiveness only grew. He began checking up on her more, demanding to know who she was with, where she was going, and why she was spending time with certain people. What had once felt like sweet affection began to feel more like a tight, suffocating grip around her. The tipping point came one evening during a quiet dinner at his favorite restaurant, a place he had taken her on their third date. The candles flickered softly on the table as they ate, and for a moment, it felt like the night could slip back into the comfortable ease of their earlier days. But then, Jake made a comment that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "You know," he said, his voice almost too casual, "teaching kindergarten is cute and all, but don't you want more out of life?" He paused, leaning in slightly as though he were about to impart some deep wisdom. "You'd make an amazing trophy wife," he added, his eyes scanning her face as if waiting for her to react. Sarah froze, unsure whether he was joking or if he truly meant it. She let out a nervous laugh, trying to brush off the discomfort rising in her chest. I'm not sure what you mean," she stammered, her smile wavering as she searched his face for any sign of a joke. But when she looked into his eyes, there was no trace of humor there. Instead, she saw something else. A coldness, an expectation. His gaze was calculating, measuring her, as if he had already decided who she was meant to be in his life. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and her stomach twisted in a way she couldn't ignore. For the first time, Sarah felt a creeping sense of unease. This wasn't the man she had fallen for. The charming, spontaneous, attentive Jake. This was someone else entirely. Someone who saw her not as an equal, but as a possession, a reflection of his own desires. Her heart ached as she realized that perhaps her fairy tale wasn't quite as perfect as it seemed. Act 3, The Descent. Jake's behavior continued to deteriorate, and what had once felt like a whirlwind romance began to feel more like a storm, slowly tearing everything apart. His once constant affection became laced with control, and his charm, once magnetic, started to feel suffocating. He began isolating Sarah from her friends and family, gradually convincing her that the people she had always turned to for support didn't understand their relationship. Whenever Sarah mentioned missing her friends, Jake's response was swift and dismissive. "They're just jealous of what we have," he'd say with a shrug, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. At first, Sarah tried to brush it off, but as time passed, it became clear that his words were part of a much larger plan, one to cut her off from the people who cared about her. Whenever she tried to talk to her family, he would make excuses or subtly undermine their importance. "They don't know what it's like to be with someone like me," Jake would say, his voice coated in condescension. "They'll never understand us, Sarah. It's just you and me now." His words began to sink in, and before long, Sarah found herself withdrawing from her loved ones, believing Jake's claims that their concerns were unfounded. She wanted to believe in him, to trust that he had her best interests at heart, but something inside her was starting to waver. When Sarah finally tried to voice her concerns, hoping that he would understand, Jake twisted her words and made her feel small, as though she were overreacting. "You're being too sensitive," he'd say with a dismissive wave, like her feelings were nothing more than an inconvenience. "I'm just looking out for you. Why can't you see that? I'm the one who cares about you, who's always there for you." His words would sound so reasonable, so loving, that she started to believe him. Maybe she was being overly emotional. Maybe she was imagining things. But every time she questioned his actions, the doubt in her mind grew, even as he seemed to tighten his grip. His temper flared more frequently, and it wasn't just the subtle, passive-aggressive remarks that got under her skin. It was the anger, the sharpness in his tone, the way he would lash out at the smallest things. One night, after a minor disagreement, something as trivial as miscommunication over dinner plans, Jake's anger erupted. Sarah had barely finished explaining herself when Jake slammed his hand onto the table with a force that rattled the glasses. She jumped back in shock, her heart racing in her chest. "Why do you always have to make things so difficult?" he shouted, his face contorted in rage. The room fell silent except for the pounding of Sarah's heart. The weight of his words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. For a brief moment, she could only stare at him, unsure how to react. Her hands trembled as she tried to compose herself, her mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. How had it escalated so quickly? Was this the man she had fallen in love with? As the tension in the room simmered, Sarah found herself walking on eggshells more than ever before. She became hyper-aware of his moods, constantly scanning for any signs of his anger, trying to predict what would set him off next. Every word she spoke felt like it could trigger a storm, and so she began to bite her tongue, second-guessing everything she said and did. She tried to please him in every way possible, hoping that if she could just get it right, if she could just meet his expectations, things would go back to the way they were. She made excuses for his behavior. He was just stressed from work, she told herself. Or maybe she was the one causing the problems. After all, he had said so himself. Maybe she just needed to try harder, to be more understanding. She blamed herself, convinced that if she could just be the perfect partner, everything would fall into place. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. Every time Jake lost his temper, every time he manipulated her feelings, a small part of Sarah began to recognize the truth. This wasn't love. This wasn't healthy. The person she was with wasn't the man she thought he was, and yet she couldn't seem to find the strength to walk away. She had been swept into this world of manipulation and control, and as much as she wanted to believe things could get better, a quiet, unsettling voice inside her began to wonder if they ever would. Act 4. The Breaking Point. The final straw came one evening when Jake's anger escalated beyond words, turning into something more dangerous. It was late. Sarah had just come home from work, tired from the long day of teaching. The house was quiet, save for the sound of Jake pacing back and forth in the living room. She had learned to read the signs, the tense jaw, the way his hands clenched into fists. It was coming. Another argument was inevitable. As soon as Sarah walked in, Jake began, his voice laced with irritation over something trivial. At first, she tried to stay calm, to respond as calmly as possible, but Jake's temper flared quickly. He accused her of not paying attention to him, of neglecting their relationship. "You don't care about me anymore," he shouted, his voice rising with every word. Sarah, exhausted and defeated, tried to explain, but it was no use. His anger was like a storm that couldn't be calmed. In the blink of an eye, he moved toward her, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and uneven. "You're lucky I put up with you," he hissed through clenched teeth, the words coming out like venom. The sheer rage in his eyes was enough to make her stomach twist. She froze, terrified, her heart pounding in her chest. His proximity, the menacing tone of his voice, the way his hands twitched as if he wanted to do more, she felt cornered, both physically and emotionally. Jake's words hung in the air, sharp and dangerous. For the first time, Sarah felt the weight of the power imbalance between them, the way his anger could swallow her whole. She had seen glimpses of this side of him before, but this was different. It wasn't just verbal abuse, it was physical intimidation, a warning that she was no longer safe, that she was at his mercy. Terrified and shaken to her core, Sarah fled the kitchen as quickly as she could, her legs trembling beneath her. She retreated to the bedroom, locking the door behind her. Her breath came in short, desperate gasps as she sat on the edge of the bed, trying to calm herself. She had never felt more alone, more helpless. The man she had fallen in love with had become someone unrecognizable, someone who could hurt her with words and now with his presence. But even in her fear, there was a voice deep inside that urged her to reach out for help. This couldn't be normal. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Sarah called her best friend Emma, her voice shaky with emotion as she explained what had happened. Emma had been growing increasingly concerned about the changes in Sarah, noticing the distance between her and her loved ones, the way she seemed to always walk on eggshells around Jake. Emma's concern had turned to worry, and she knew that something had to be done. The very next day, Emma staged an intervention, gathering Sarah's closest friends to help her see the truth. They all gathered in a quiet cafe, faces filled with concern, as Emma gently guided the conversation. "Sarah," Emma said softly, her eyes full of empathy, "we need to talk. We've noticed things that don't seem right." At first, Sarah bristled, defensive and unwilling to hear it. She didn't want to believe that the man she loved was capable of hurting her. But as the conversation unfolded, her friends began to show her the patterns they had witnessed, patterns of control, manipulation, and emotional abuse that she had been too blinded by love to see. They pointed out the red flags she had been ignoring, the subtle isolations from family and friends, the controlling behavior disguised as concern, the way Jake's anger seemed to consume him. One of her friends handed her a few printed articles about abusive relationships. "Sarah," the article began, "abuse doesn't always come in the form of physical violence, but the emotional scars can be just as damaging." As she read, a chill ran down her spine. The words were familiar, too familiar. It was like reading her own story. Everything she had been experiencing, all the warning signs she had brushed aside, laid out in black and white. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as the realization hit her. She wasn't imagining it. This wasn't normal. She had been trapped in a cycle of emotional abuse, slowly being worn down by someone who claimed to love her, but whose actions told a different story. Her friends continued to support her, their gentle voices guiding her through the fog of confusion. Sarah was torn. She still loved the man Jake had been at the beginning, the charming, kind man who had made her feel special, who had shown her what it felt like to be adored. That man still existed, didn't he? The man she had fallen in love with couldn't possibly be the same person who had threatened her, who had manipulated her into believing she was the problem. But the truth was, staring her in the face, undeniable and harsh. She couldn't keep ignoring the pain he was causing her. Her heart ached as she thought of Jake, the man she had built a life with, the person she had dreamed of a future with. It felt like her heart was being ripped in two. The love she had for him was real, but it was being suffocated by his cruelty. In that moment, Sarah knew she couldn't keep living this way. The choice she had to make felt impossible, but the seed of self-worth, once buried beneath the weight of his manipulation, had begun to grow. For the first time in months, Sarah felt the faint stirrings of strength within herself. She deserved better. She deserved to feel safe, to feel loved in a way that wasn't tainted by fear and control. The breaking point had come, and Sarah knew that the time had come for her to break free. Act 5. The Awakening. One morning, as Sarah got ready for work, She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing through her hair absently. It was a routine she had done countless times before, but today something felt different. She paused, her hand frozen in midair, as her eyes met her reflection. The woman staring back at her was unfamiliar. There was a hollow emptiness in her eyes, a dullness that hadn't been there before. The sparkle that once defined her had vanished, replaced by a weariness she couldn't ignore. Her skin, once glowing with vitality, now appeared tired, as though every day had been a battle. She looked older, more worn down. It was in that moment that Sarah realized she didn't recognize the person she had become. The weight of the emotional toll Jake's manipulation and anger had taken on her became undeniable. The woman in the mirror was a stranger, someone who had lost herself in a relationship that had drained her, broken her down piece by piece. She wasn't the bright, passionate woman who had once eagerly pursued her career, laughed with her friends, or enjoyed the simple pleasures of life. She had become someone defined by fear, anxiety, and the need to please. That realization hit her like a tidal wave. For so long, she had been swept up in Jake's control, convincing herself that things could improve, that the man she once knew would return. But the truth was, she had been living in a state of constant survival. And now, she was simply surviving, not living. That day, Sarah made the hardest decision of her life. She knew that the time had come to break free, to reclaim her life and her sense of self. It wasn't going to be easy, and her heart was heavy with doubt. But she couldn't keep pretending. She couldn't keep sacrificing her well-being for the sake of a relationship that had only caused her pain. When Jake came over that evening, he was his usual self, charming at first, then slowly shifting into the familiar pattern of controlling behavior. But Sarah wasn't going to let him sway her this time. As he sat on the couch, casually asking about her day, she felt her hands tremble. But the voice that came from her was firm, steady. "This isn't healthy, Jake," she said, her voice catching slightly but gaining strength with every word. "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep living like this. And I can't keep being with someone who makes me feel like I'm nothing. I deserve better than this." Jake's face changed in an instant, his calm demeanor twisting into something darker. He stood up, fury flickering in his eyes, and began his usual manipulation. "You don't mean that, Sarah," he said, his voice smooth, as if trying to convince her with every word. "We can work this out. You just need to see how much I love you. I'm sorry, I've been stressed. Let's just forget about all this, okay?" His apology was hollow, just another tactic to reel her back in. But Sarah wasn't buying it anymore. She'd heard his promises before, and they meant nothing now. Her heart pounded, but she refused to let fear control her. "No," she replied firmly. "This isn't love, Jake. This is manipulation, and I won't stand for it anymore." Jake's anger flared, his voice rising as he tried to break her resolve. "You're being ridiculous. Don't you see what I'm doing for you? I'm the only one who cares about you. You'll regret this." But Sarah stood tall, her hands shaking not from fear, but from the strength she was finally finding within herself. She had lived in the shadow of his manipulation for far too long, and now, for the first time, she was standing in the light. "I won't regret it," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm doing this for me." With a deep breath, she began packing her things, taking only what she could carry in the moment. It wasn't easy. Every item she placed in her bag felt like a reminder of everything she was leaving behind: the good, the bad, the memories, and the pain. But as she closed the door behind her, something inside her clicked. The chains that had bound her to Jake, to his anger, his control, his manipulation, they had finally been broken. Her heart was heavy with sorrow and uncertainty, but her resolve was unshakable. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a flicker of hope, the glimmer of a future she could control. In the months that followed, Sarah embarked on the long, difficult journey of healing. She reconnected with her loved ones, the friends and family she had distanced herself from. Their support was unconditional, and slowly, Sarah began to remember who she was before Jake. Strong, independent, vibrant. She rediscovered her passions, the things that had once filled her with excitement and purpose: painting, writing, and long walks in the park. She took her time, no longer rushing through life but savoring the moments that reminded her of who she truly was. Slowly, Sarah rebuilt her sense of self-worth, piece by piece, allowing herself the space to grieve for the woman she had lost and to celebrate the woman she was becoming. She learned to trust herself again, to embrace the freedom of being her own person without fear or shame. The road ahead wasn't easy, and there were days when the pain of the past would resurface, threatening to pull her back into the shadows. But Sarah knew that she was no longer the woman who had been broken. She was healing, and with every step she grew stronger, more whole. The journey was long, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah was moving forward, towards a life she could finally call her own. Epilogue. Sarah's experience, painful and transformative as it was, became the catalyst for a deeper purpose. She couldn't shake the memory of the women she had met during her own journey, the women who had silently suffered as she once had, whose stories echoed hers in ways she couldn't ignore. Determined to make a difference, Sarah began volunteering at a local women's shelter, offering her time and her heart to those who needed it most. Every week, she would walk into the shelter, a safe haven for women fleeing from abusive relationships, and speak to them not as an outsider, but as someone who had lived through the same fears, the same doubts. She shared her story with raw honesty, not to relive the pain, but to help others see that they weren't alone. She spoke about the insidious nature of emotional and psychological abuse, the manipulative words, the controlling behaviors, the constant erosion of self-worth. She told them how she had walked away from the man she loved, even when it seemed impossible. Sarah's story resonated with many of the women at the shelter. She would listen as they shared their own struggles, their hearts weighed down by fear, shame, and guilt. Through her, they began to see that there was life after abuse, that there was hope beyond the darkness. Her vulnerability became their strength, a beacon that showed them a path toward healing. Sarah knew that it wasn't just her words that made the difference. It was her presence, the way she had fought to reclaim her life, her soul, and her happiness. She wasn't just telling them to survive. She was showing them how to thrive. Years passed and Sarah continued to volunteer, her involvement in the shelter growing as she became an advocate for domestic violence awareness. She helped to organize community events, led workshops, and connected women with resources that could help them rebuild their lives. She didn't just offer her story, but her unwavering belief in the power of change. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when she found herself reliving some of the pain of the past. But Sarah always came back stronger. She had learned to channel her experiences into something greater than herself, to give other women the courage to take back their power, to know their worth, and to walk away from relationships that threatened to consume them. As Sarah found her voice, life began to unfold in unexpected ways. One evening, through a mutual friend, Sarah met Alex, a man who was kind and gentle, with an open heart and a deep sense of respect for her. Their connection was immediate, but unlike any relationship she'd had before, it was grounded in understanding, mutual respect, and honesty. Alex didn't try to fix her, didn't push her boundaries, but supported her in every way possible. He encouraged Sarah to be her true self, to chase after her passions, and to heal in the ways she needed to. For the first time in a long while, Sarah didn't feel like she had to prove anything. She wasn't someone else's project or a reflection of someone else's expectations. With Alex, she felt seen and valued for who she truly was. He loved her, not in spite of her past, but with full understanding of it. They built a relationship based on trust, communication, and shared values. There were no games, no manipulation, just a deep, genuine connection that made her feel safe, cherished, and supported. Together, Sarah and Alex built a life full of laughter, joy, and shared dreams. They traveled, built a home, and grew as individuals and as a couple. Sarah, for the first time in years, allowed herself to truly embrace love, not just from Alex, but from herself. She had learned the importance of self-love, of filling her own cup before expecting anyone else to. She had learned that healing was a lifelong journey, one that required patience, compassion, and grace. Sarah's journey was a testament to the strength of the human spirit. She had faced a darkness so deep that it seemed as though it would swallow her whole. But she had emerged from it, stronger and more resilient than ever. The woman who had once felt lost in the shadows was now standing in the light, surrounded by love and surrounded by her own strength. Her heart was full, full of love, full of hope, and full of the peace she had fought so hard to find. Through her journey, Sarah had come to realize that her greatest love story was not the one she had with Jake or the one with Alex, but the one she had with herself, and that, she knew, was the most important relationship of all.